hit the noon hour here. So if it sounds okay, maybe we'll go ahead and get started, and other folks will continue to join, I'm sure. So hey, first, welcome everyone to the Ostrom Workshop Research Series. We're really excited to be able to continue our Ostrom Book Club today with a very special new edited volume that was co-edited by Dean Sheila Foster from Georgetown Law on the call here, and it's entitled The Cambridge Handbook of Commons Research Innovations, with a wide breadth of topics, and some of the chapter authors are actually on the line. You'll get to hear from them in person, and we'll be sure to put up a link as well in the chat here for anybody interested in taking a look firsthand. So we couldn't be more thrilled to feature this project and to feature you, Sheila. So thanks for taking the time, and if you'd like to, feel free to kick us off from there.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you for featuring the book. It's really was a labor of love, starting from the conference that this grows out of. But let me start from the beginning. The idea for the conference that the book grows out of, actually, I have to credit Brig Daniels, because at one of the previous large IASC conferences, he came up to me and said, "Hey, it's going to be the 50th anniversary of Tragedy of the Commons. We should do like a conference to review like where the Commons literature is." And of course, it was also that year, the 30th anniversary of Ostrom's book, groundbreaking book. And so we kind of conceptualized and invited scholars from around the world to Georgetown University, where I teach, to have this conference. And they just was overwhelmed with the response. I think more than 40 papers on all kinds of topics. And the book really is the kind of monument to that conference. Obviously, it doesn't contain all the papers, and it actually contained some papers of people who were not at the conference. But for the most part, it represents the variety of ways in which the concept of the commons has not just been dramatically kind of expanded, one may say, to include many kinds of shared resources, both physical and virtual, in addition to other topics that are cross-cutting across disciplines, such as something that I work on, obviously, cities and urban infrastructure. I mean, we've had the field of the knowledge commons, but also in this book are civil society organizations and humanitarian aid a kind of commons. So one of the things that we wanted this book, and calling it Innovations in Common Theory, is to, in commons theory, is to think about, the ways in which commons theory opens up new and different contexts for us to explore a range of theoretical and applied questions, and to highlight new social dilemmas and institutional questions that have normative implications for common scholarship. And that's what the book represents. And as you'll see, I think someone put a link in the chat, as you'll see from the table of contents and the way that the book is organized, the organizing principles, I think, lay out the capacious, one might say, or transformative nature of the topics and the field, frankly, now. And so I'm happy to have on board today Brian Burns, who's an independent researcher and consulting sociologist, Bill Bloomquist, who we all know, who's a senior research fellow at the Ostrom Workshop, Eric Nordman, who's a professor at Grand Valley State University, and Scott Shackelford, who's the executive director of the Ostrom Workshop, talk about their work in the book. So without further ado, we're happy to answer any questions at the end. I'm going to turn it over. Who's first? Scott, is it Brian?
Indeed it is. And thank you so much, Sheila, for that.
So it should be Bill if Bill wants to say anything.
Oh, it's Bill. Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Well, hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. And Sheila, especially, as always, good to be with you. I was honored to be asked to contribute to this book, and my contribution is a chapter about linking the origins and the more recent extensions of work on the commons. And so just to give you a very brief summary of this, the book as a whole highlights, as the title suggests, innovations in commons research. And so there is a tremendous amount of work, and as Sheila indicated, the breadth of it, the number of topics, as well as the number of researchers, has expanded tremendously over the last 20 years. So the handbook attempts to highlight a lot of that and sort of catch up with what's been going on. And if there's a flip side to that, it would be that some folks might be a little grumpy about the extension of commons research into a wider variety of fields, because after all, this idea might go, we all know what commons are, we all know what common pool resources are, and we should stick to our knitting and just, study the commons the way God meant the commons to be, which is to say, natural resources shared by multiple users. And so my chapter even includes a reference to some folks who were expressing concern about the way in which commons is, the concept of the commons and the advocacy of commons and so forth have stretched way beyond their original definitions. And I characterize this not in the chapter, but just generally my way of thinking about this is a phrase I borrowed from a dear friend who said, there are some people who take the position that all cottage cheese must be made in cottages. That there's there's a one right way to do things, and it was fixed at the outset, and there you go. So part of the way that the chapter attempts to address that is to talk about what Elinor Ostrom was about when she was doing the work that led up to governing the commons, and that the work on the commons was about her work on the commons was also about much more than the commons. And that it came in tandem with the development of the institutional analysis and development framework, the IAD framework. And the commons is a particularly interesting to Lynn and particularly interesting to the rest of us, but a particular kind of action situation. And that when we analyze an action situation, the biophysical characteristics of the situation are important, but they're not solely determinative. So are, culture and community, so are the rules in use. And so an action situation can be like a commons situation for multiple reasons. And therefore, the concept of the commons isn't necessarily tethered to the natural resource context. And there is plenty of room to extend commons research in all of these innovative and interesting ways without necessarily violating some canon that we somehow came crawling down the side of a mountain on stone tablets or something that says a commons is a commons is a commons. So that's what mine about. By the way, I just want to say that my chapter is very closely related to a chapter that Mike McGinnis contributed to another edited volume. That edited volume came out around the time that the volume that Sheila's telling us about today was getting started. And so Mike also drew the link between the commons and the IAD framework and did that very thoroughly. So that's another place to look for additional thought on this, and I'll hand it back. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. It was fantastic. I'm wondering, just as we suggested at the opening, if folks have any questions or comments for you before we keep the train rolling here. Anything come up, guys, listening to Bill? It's fantastic. Going once, going twice. we can return to a more general discussion toward the end, because there's, as you said, Bill, a lot of common themes spread throughout these chapters that I think are worth unpacking a bit more. So unless there's any interjections now, I'd suggest we just continue on then. And David, am I correct that Brian's next?
You are correct.
Okay. Brian, over to you, sir. And I think you have a slide, right? So we can get
Yes,
that up.
so David should be set up to show that. So thanks, and I'll mention it really was a great conference, including in the sense of having time to meet, interact with people I wouldn't otherwise, either wouldn't been in the same conference or they were off in some other specialized track. So the conference was good. And then thanks to the editors who, among other things, pushed me to less jargon, try and explain clearer. So I hope it's at least somewhat better. So that was a good part of being in the book. So this chapter talks about a map for escaping social dilemmas, in a sense, showing ways to get from free riding to stable win-win cooperation. The climate crisis and trying to control greenhouse gases is often framed as a tragedy of the commons. Everybody would be better off collectively controlling emissions, but each person, business, country has incentives to continue polluting. So yeah, you go buy an electric car and I'll keep on using my old car or whatever. As many of you know, prisoner's dilemma in game theory is a very simple two-person model that makes extremely clear the particular logic of this kind of social dilemma where you have a conflict between individual and collective interests. However, especially like climate change, what if, unlike prisoner's dilemma, if both people don't cooperate, you're facing a real disaster, catastrophe, then that's a different game for which the simple two-person model is chicken. It's still a nice cooperative solution, but each is still tempted to defect from that. But if both of them try and free ride, don't contribute, then you can be in a disaster. Or more optimistically, maybe if there's a big enough effort to make changes, put renewable energy in place, improve efficiency, stop burning fossil fuels and other things, as long as there's a critical mass of cooperation, that's yet another game, a stag hunt with a stable win-win solution, where the critical question is trust, how to assure that others will cooperate. More changes could create an even nicer game where cooperation is always the better choice, whatever the other person does, and both get win-win, like the game of Concord, which should be there in the slide. These game theory models, and this is the key kind of method that I'm applying, differ by switching the ranks of the outcomes, changing the top two outcomes to turn prisoner's dilemma into a stag hunt. This chapter applies Robinson and Goforth's topology of 2x2 games, basically to make a map of many possible models and multiple pathways for escaping social dilemmas. It builds on some earlier work and extends that to say there's some additional models, including one that fits with the geoengineering scenario, which I see Prakash is here, and he's written some interesting things on that of, well, wait a minute, what if two people trying to do something would make it worse, or even one could be much worse? And how do you think about that kind of situation? So I could go on, but again, in summary, this is a map for looking at ways to move from social dilemmas to cooperation. And in the larger program, which the book is a great contribution to, ways to understand institutional diversity and self-governance, how people can work together to make their lives better. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Really, really well done as always. Any quick questions, reflections, comments for Brian? I know it's a bit out of the norm because usually we just open it up for a broad discussion at the end. So maybe we should just stick with that. Going once, going twice for now, though. Okay. I think Eric, you are up next.
All right. Yes. Thank you very much. And David, I think will post a slide. So my project and contribution to the book came after the conference. I wasn't able to attend that conference, so I was a latecomer to this, but I really appreciate Sheila for being able to fit me in. And so So my work was on a conceptual model of polycentric resource governance in the 2030 Energy District program. So this 2030 district program exists in 23 cities across North America, including the US and Canada. And each of these cities draws a downtown district and invites building owners to voluntarily reduce their energy and water consumption. And they have targets that they're supposed to meet by the year 2030. That's where the name comes from. So this is a really beyond compliance type of approach. And there are lots of ways to do that. There are programs that encourage, individual buildings to adopt energy efficiency practices and things like that. But this is a really interesting one because it creates a collective action situation. It does that intentionally in an effort so that the whole group can move together towards improved energy efficiency, water efficiency, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So in looking at this, I used Petoskey and Prakash's club theory of voluntary environmental programs. Asim Prakash was one of Lynn's graduate students, and he told me that he has an interesting connection to the workshop. In addition, Lynn actually performed his wedding ceremony. So that was a really fascinating just aside that I learned in talking with him. And just shows like the connections, the human connections within this community. It was really great. And I also used Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework. And in this club theory, Petoskey and Prakash look at these different environmental clubs, these voluntary approaches, and they rank them on or rate them on strictness of standards and enforcement. If you have standards that aren't very strict and you don't really enforce them, then these programs are easy to join, but they don't achieve very much in terms of environmental benefits. At the other extreme, you can have really strict standards and very strict enforcement, but then very few people are actually going to join the program. And again, you're not going to have a lot of aggregate impact. So it's more complicated than that, but the bottom line is that there's kind of a sweet spot in the middle, which has a reasonable level of strictness that doesn't scare everybody away, but also has enough enforcement that you're actually going to get, you're going to move that needle and actually reduce the environmental impact. So that's where I think the 2030 district kind of fits in. It's in kind of that sweet spot. But you might ask, well, what do you get out of joining? What is the benefit of joining this? We used this institutional analysis and development framework to kind of conceptualize what might be driving some of these decisions. People that join or building owners that join get access to preferred clients. They can enhance their reputations. They get to share best practices. They have access to different services that might be at a discount or various information sources that might be unavailable to them. There's also a sense of friendly competition that people are getting together. It's a social event. In Grand Rapids, where I live, we have a 2030 district. The US Green Building Council runs the program. They also have another program called the Battle of the Buildings, where building owners actually compete against one another to reduce their energy or improve their energy efficiency. And there's also a sense of behavioral contagion, which is something that Robert Frank talks about at Cornell. And this idea that you can, once you see someone doing something that might be unusual, you get a sense that this is comfortable and yeah, people are doing this and I don't feel like such a weirdo installing solar panels on my rooftop or doing something like that. So this was a really helpful approach in understanding the decision-making in this 2030 district program. So I look forward to working with this with more data and actually interviewing some of the participants in the future. So thanks a lot for letting me share.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really fascinating. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, can I ask a question,
Please,
Scott?
please do. Of course.
So, hi, Eric.
Hello.
Thanks for the presentation. So my question is, where does polycentricity lie in this dynamic? So I understood there is some competition, but it appeared to me that the only players are within separate cities, but maybe I missed something. So if you could clarify.
So It actually, there is quite a bit of polycentric organization. So it's a nationwide program. Actually, I mean, it's a network that spans multiple countries, right? So you've got this overarching network with a uniform set of standard or targets. So we're going to reduce our building energy efficiency or improve our building energy efficiency by 50% by 2030. Everybody agrees to adopt that, but there's no one size fits all approach on how to get there. So then at the city level, the cities sign up and they draw this downtown district, and then they invite the building owners to join. So now you have a level of organization at the city level, and they, together, they're making decisions about what's going to be our baseline, how are we going to achieve this, what kind of information are we going to share. And then you have decision making at the building level too, the building owner, the building manager, about which practices they're going to put in. So it is actually quite polycentric. It's really interesting.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Great question, Sally. Any other questions? Comments? Again, we can return to, Brian, did you have something? Or are you okay? No, okay, yeah, we can return to exploring some of these common themes. In just a moment. I think though I'm perhaps next. I think, David, okay?
Yes.
Okay.
You are
All
next.
right.
Go.
Well, we'll keep this short and sweet as well, everybody. And Angie unfortunately had a conflict with a conference going on in Japan right now, so sends her apologies. But we co-author this chapter together. And as you'll note on the flyer there, it's really broad and tries to do a lot broadly on this concept of data governance and this kind of much bandied about, digital Cold War that we may or may not, be seeing some early signs of right now. So what this chapter, tries to do is marry, frankly, a few disciplines together. And in some cases, they can be strange bedfellows, but I'll leave you to judge and we can discuss it further. It opens with the discussion broadly of the trend toward liberalization, in trade generally, including data, less so in services, and some of the blowback, some of the pushback against those trends that we've seen, resulting from rising, inequalities, the resulting populist movements that we've seen in the US and around the world, and a drive toward greater protectionism and data localization, right? One of the really interesting things that we try to grapple with, I'm not sure how effectively, frankly, in the chapter is to think through, kind of two trends that are happening at the same time. On the one hand, we're seeing the evolution of cyberspace, and you might have heard these, terms like Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, but, long story short, it's the extent to which we're seeing cyberspace in some ways return to what we saw to an extent in the 90s, right? So instead of it just being, a read-only or a system built on, lots of interesting user-generated blogs to a more, enclosed ecosystem, now we're seeing a return potentially to this much more distributed architecture built on the back of some new technologies like blockchain. But pushing back against that are, efforts from a lot of countries, not just Russia and China, but they're often, singled out, plenty of others, in this direction of cyber sovereignty, right? Of kind of locking down, of considering cyberspace more or less as an extension of national territory for purposes of, regulation, commerce, but also just thinking more broadly about what the space can and should be. So in other words, on the one hand, we see technology opening up some new tools to think about this really distributed architecture, which we think some of the traditions of the workshop, including polycentricity, can help us kind of better understand, while at the same time, this kind of classic, geopolitical Cold War mentality is entering the fray. And we focus on particular on, all the debates around 5G and Huawei and how that's fed into, some of this narrative. And then, toward the end of the piece, we're trying to look at, what lessons can we learn from, polycentricity generally. We know it's not certainly no panacea, as Mike and others on the call have raised, in the past, looking at healthcare and otherwise. But, it can be a useful tool in helping us think through what the next, iteration, the next phase of internet governance would look like. And we kind of lay out 3 chapters so far, and we seem to be entering into this fourth chapter right now. And it's not, entirely clear what form that's going to take, because it's kind of funny because, Russia, for example, is one of the biggest proponents of thinking about the internet as this polycentric system, in part because they see it as an antidote to a much more kind of Western dominated, or at least that's how they view it, system of internet governance, with ICANN, for example, being based in the US still, right? And that's one of the data points that they point to. So we end the piece by kind of looking out a few years to 2025, which is this next big convening of the World Summit on Information Systems that's going to be taking place in Moscow. And it looks like there's going to be a major focus and at least some drive toward realizing this notion of cyber sovereignty, potentially more through the UN than we've seen in the past. So in other words, much more multilateral approach to internet governance than the more polycentric, multi-stakeholder approach that we've seen through these kind of previous iterations. So we try to think through, well, what are some of the implications of that going to be for the Internet of Things, for kind of this shared infrastructure that we're building out by utilizing some of these Web 3.0 services. So in other words, like I said, bit of a marriage between some of the different methodologies that the workshop is known for, but trying to make it, relevant, hopefully, and thinking through, some of these pressing geopolitical and, technological challenges. So that's a little bit about the chapter. We get into standards as well, including efforts from some groups, including Huawei, to really take over the standard setting process, and some of these which had hitherto been more or less kind of volunteer-driven bodies like the Internet Engineering Task Force, and what impact that's having. And there's definitely lessons there from other contexts that we explore a bit in this chapter, but I think it could do a lot more of as well. So don't want to go on for too long, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of some of the major topics that we touch on in this chapter. And we don't do, frankly, a lot with GKC or some of the other frameworks. We did that in some other papers in the past. So hopefully it gives you a flavor anyway. Happy to chat more about it if anybody's interested, but it was a lot of fun to write. So thanks again, Sheila, for the opportunity.
It was a lot of fun to edit.
Brilliant. And we've hit pretty much our typical, halfway point here in this session. So this is when we traditionally, turn toward discussion. So I think, several common themes have emerged, as you've heard in just these couple chapters. And again, we encourage you to take a look at the full table of contents, because there's just such a rich array, diverse array of authors, of topics. But, polycentricity clearly is one of those themes, among others. So who would like to, kick us off with some thoughts, some suggestions here?
Let me just
Sheila, please. Yeah,
add a couple things that I think fascinated me as I was editing the book. One is, and I wondered if I could take the temperature of the group we have on. And so I want to go back to Bill's chapter, which is, is the idea of the commons and the research grown a little too capacious? It's like the big umbrella, the big tent, right? And I wonder what people think about that as we see an expansion. And I think this book represents really an expansion of not just the concept, but the methodological approaches to commons. And the second that I found fascinating from the book is the kinds of institutions that we might call a commons-based institution. So there are chapters in there about, public housing as a commons, right? Community land trust, certain kinds of urban art. So for me, those two questions are really interesting questions. So anyway, I'll just, get us started on that. I see that other people have questions. There's a queue in the chat, Scott.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Sheila. And that's such a great provocation. So I agree, we should unpack that more. But maybe Jamie, you'd like to start us in that process, or you can take us in a new direction and we can return to that too.
Well, maybe keep the process rolling, because Professor Foster brought up this thing that I wanted to, which is the question that gets raised among workshoppers, particularly those who've been around for a while. I think, and which is, if everything is a commons, then nothing is a commons. Like, at which point then do we draw those lines so that our definitions and our organization and our concepts continue to have meaning while expanding this area of research? yeah, so I think my question is probably mostly for Bill on that point. And it's good to see you again, Bill. It's been like too long.
Thanks, Jamie. You too. Appreciate that. Here's my initial take, and then I really hope that others will add. Even more of a core concept than polycentricity or the commons or the IAD framework, which are all core concepts around which the Ostrom workshop was built. I think a core concept that even goes further than each of those is the concept of contestation. And so let me apply that to Jamie's question, and that's this. Having, in my chapter anyway, tried to put commons research into the context of analyzing action situations, I hope and I think there's a clue hiding in there somewhere, and the clue is this: how will we know when we've taken the application of the idea of the commons too far in one direction or another, or in one application or another? And part of it will be when we can't articulate to the satisfaction of our colleagues in what way this action situation is a commons. And to be able to sort of walk back through the framework and say, well, it has these characteristics, but not these. It has those characteristics, but not this one, etc. And so, I think that it's hard to, and no one's suggesting otherwise, I was just thinking out loud here, I think it's hard to sort of set a priori contours around the concept. I think the concept and whatever its limits are will emerge through contestation as people who are familiar and engaged in this work question each other and say, well, I'm not entirely sure you got a commons there, and let's think this through and let's go back through it and so forth. So that's my initial reaction. Jamie, good to see you. Thanks for the question.
Excellent. No, thank you so much, Bill. And I looks like maybe Brian, feel free to interject to Jamie's point, then Eric.
Yeah, okay. I'll just kind of follow on in terms of what Bill was talking about in terms of contestation and so on. And as somebody who, started getting way into water rights, which ended up reading law and legal concepts and so on, I've actually, and those ideas of property, very much appreciated the stuff out of, the work on urban commons that Sheila and others have done, and the work on commoning. But a lot of it is about whether people assert a claim. If they say, we like to go walking around this shopping mall and this is important to us, and therefore if we're upset, or this piece of abandoned land in the city and we want to just clean it up or set up a community garden, it's by their own actions and the collective action, the attempt at some kind of governance that gets interesting to see what happens and how people try and manage something that they share. So
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brian. And Eric?
Yeah, I always go back to Lynn and Vincent's 1977 paper where they introduced that 4-box framework where it's subtractable, non-subtractable, exclusive and non-exclusive. And commons in that framework has a very specific definition that it's, that is subtractable and non-exclusive, which applies to a lot of situations. But the 2030 districts actually is more of a public good where people are coming together to form this collective action situation to do something, to overcome a free rider problem. It's not really subtractable. It is, how do you get people to do more? So I think the strictly looking at commons might be too limited, but it naturally extends into public goods, which are non-subtractable or non-rival and non-exclusive. But I think they're kind of the flip side of the same coin.
Such a good point, Eric. Yeah, it just depends a lot on your kind of unit of analysis and the level of governance that you're interested in digging into further, right? And we run into the same thing in thinking about cyberspace all the time, because at one level it's a global network commons, as Hillary Clinton has argued, right, in the past, among others. And At another level, it could be it's a clearly composed of a series of private goods of shared infrastructure. There's some club goods going on. Cybersecurity can be conceptualized as a public good, like national security. So I agree. I think keeping in mind that, just diverse array of issue areas kind of embedded in each of these topics is important, and thinking through, which tools are most appropriate at which level, right? And at which to deal with each topic. Sheila, did you want to? Yeah.
Prakash is in the queue from the chat. So I just wanted to
Great, yes.
remind us.
Prakash, let's turn to you next. That'd be great. And Jamie, we can do a follow-up.
Hi, everybody. Such a fantastic discussion, and congratulations, Sheila and everybody else for the book. So I think I'm going to add to what Eric said, that the article on theory of public goods, and this later article on how types of goods and property rights jointly affect collective action is relevant to these discussions. And I think there are 2 or 3 different issues that I wanted to sort of flag, and I might have a question for Brian. One, there are there's this, the analytical concept of commons as devised by Lynn and others at the workshop. And a related notion is the sort of normative idea of common and commoning. And we grappled with this discussion in the recent article that Florian, myself, Pranita, and Sheila, we published in the current research in environmental sustainability, where we talked about how these concepts come from different communities, and they need to be weighed in accordingly based on the way in which these concepts are thought about by each of those respective communities. And of course, then you can bring them on the same analytical plane by subjecting one to the perspective of another concept and vice versa. So that's one idea, to try and think about different legacies and different implications of commons and commoning coming from these 2 different communities. Within our tradition, like within the workshop tradition, I think thinking about the distinction between commons and public goods really actually produces fantastic insights. And Rob Hallahan and I, who both of us agreed about this paper from 2003 as being one of the best pieces of Lynn's work that we like, we wrote this article using the example of geoengineering that Brian referred to. And that was in a journal called Global Transitions. And what we argue here in that paper is that if you actually think about geoengineering as a public good, it actually tells us a lot about both about the theory of public goods as well as about the geoengineering and its governance itself. For example, the archetypical example of public goods is the lighthouse, right? The nice looking scenic lighthouse. But we sort of take that as an analytical starting point, and we argue that even a lighthouse produces negative externality for the families who live close to the lighthouse because of the glare that the lights produce. So if you take that idea and think about every public good as being a composite of negative and positive externalities, then you can actually start thinking about public goods in a different light from a distributional perspective. And then you are faced with the question of at what point a public good stops being the public good technically defined and becoming a descriptive public bad, right? From thinking about the distributional properties of public good to thinking about the negative impact of that public good and so forth. And I think whether we can govern something as commons or not comes back to this notion of what are the properties. So if you think about global climate business, it has the properties of public good. And so we might argue that we should attempt to govern a global public good as a common good, but obviously there will be challenges because it's a very different kind of good. And so I think in that sense, the question is, do we actually go by the definition of commons as defined in the workshop, or the normative policy goal of commoning and achieving a common? And so my question for Brian is, purely from a technical perspective, are these games, how do you change the the game, if you stop thinking about something as commons and start thinking of the same thing as a public good, because obviously there's a big gray area where commons spill into public good and public good spill into and vice versa. Sorry, I went on for a long, but I thought there was several interrelated points.
No, really well done, Prakash, as always. Thank you so much for that. And Sheila, did you want to respond to any of that, or was your hand up?
Well, so let Brian respond, and then I have a general follow-up to
Perfect.
Excellent point.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, Brian, please.
Yeah, I think I'm mostly going to answer Prakash by saying yes, that there are times, when a key part of the analysis is trying to figure out what's going on and which is a more relevant model, or both may be going on. I mean, part of this topology of 2x2 games, for me, it gives a framework to think about what if properties are changing, whether, irrigation system, there's less water around in the dry season, so payouts change, or climate change. All of a sudden, things physically change. We have, forest fires, floods, or that's an update for people's information, or how salient fear of things are, or how much they start to care about what's happening to other people. What I'm talking about are these ultra simple little toy models, which sometimes help give you some conceptual clarity. The actual situation is far more complex, and this is where, Lynn's work, from governing the commons and understanding institutional diversity and working together, this is a whole huge toolkit, and the art and the challenge is, okay, which parts of this toolkit are relevant for a particular situation?
So I wanted to throw out an even bigger question, because Prakash's comment and just raise it for me. And so one of the things that I've been kind of pushing back against in my work, though not always explicitly, and I think that this book definitely calls into question, is whether the commons analytically or even methodologically belongs to classical economic thinking, right? So when we talk about public goods and common, right, there's a framework in which everyone starts. That wasn't even hard in the framework, actually. I mean, I think economists made it hard in this framework. And there's an excellent chapter in the book, problematizing Hardin. But to Prakash's point on commenting and from where this discourse comes, it's increasingly heterogeneous, right? Coming not just from social movements in various places around the world that are trying to promote anti-capitalist kind of frameworks, but even taking the framework in and of itself to be embedded with classical economics. I mean, I haven't seen any commons literature kind of even interrogate the ways that behavioral economics has called into question some of the assumptions of classical economics and rationality. So for me, I, have always thought that I wasn't bound by, because there's no reason to be bound by a classical economic framework in thinking through and analyzing the commons and the nature of the resource, nor the governance piece, which has its own, I think, characteristics that clearly go beyond economics. But again, even within an economic framework, behavioral law or economic thought calls into question some of the ways that we even think about that. So I just want to throw that open, because I think that a lot of people that writing in this field now, if not explicitly, implicitly, and I know my work does, call into question whether we need to be bound by this whole discussion about public goods versus common goods, because it's rooted in a particular framework that I don't think, should bind us.
Very, very useful, Sheila. We can't be bound, right? And I guess, Prakash, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I just to recognize that, absolutely, there's no reason for being bound. But I think I go with Brian here a little bit to say that each of these tools sheds different types of light on these issues. And so we in the classical workshop, thinking that this is just part of the toolbox, And just to give an example that we talked about, but for everybody else's convenience. So there's this historian who has mentioned the concept of commoning, and he talks about commoning as sort of being this, God-given commons. Just to get back to Bill's point, that it's a humanity heritage. Everything is like nature-given things that should be available to everybody. That's fine. That's a good normative concept. But some of the people who have tried to pursue the goals of commoning in practice in urban settings, they come back to some of the notions of, interest, conflicting interest and monitoring and its impact on how people behave and all of that. So I think as long as we keep everything in the perspective and we know that these things are coming from different directions, we have a solid sort of approach to sort of, building a bigger program, I guess.
Thanks a lot, Prakash. Excellent. And Brian, I saw your hand go up as well. Did you want to respond to any of that, or are you? Oh, I think you might still be muted. Sorry.
Yeah, very much agree with Sheila and many others that we need a much richer model of what people are and how they behave, and to be quite proactive, as Lynn was, of escaping from the particular narrow, selfish model that economists have trapped, including using just this one particular specialized situation, and looking at all the different ways, and some of which can be very rigorously framed in terms of Lynn's stuff about cheap talk and drawing on the literature of conditional cooperators, team reasoning. If we care about what happens to a group, or risk from the behavioral economics that, I kind of, and part of what I got from being a visiting scholar at the workshop again was Lynn talking about bounded rationality and all these ways that, again, we need a much broader and appropriately realistic model, because otherwise, too many economists have still trapped themselves by a set of assumptions, which then become self-fulfilling prophecies, including when they get taught in business schools or law schools or political science departments. And then people act on those, not realizing that, again, people are capable of much more, and there's all kinds of fascinating evidence about how people actually do cooperate. So leave it there.
And I would agree with both Prakash and Brian. I think it is about heterogeneity, right? And different approaches.
Yeah, I like your comment as well there, Prakash. Fantastic. And it's true to the heart of the project, right, Sheila? I mean, it's the
Indeed.
Handbook of Commons Innovation. That's part of the goal. And Bill, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, not at all. I just put my hand up because I too was prompted by what Sheila was reflecting there. And it just reminded me, and I don't want to personalize this, I just want to share that as someone whose undergraduate education had been in economics and then came to IU Bloomington in political science and saw a sign on a door that said workshop in political theory and policy analysis, and thought to myself, well, that seems like an interesting place to put those things together. So that personal aside to get to this, we not only don't have to be bound by the classical economic framing of the commons problem, we have to think about the role of politics. And because it is one thing for us to envision normatively commoning as a goal. It is another thing for us to analyze using economic framework a common situation and to maybe generalize that to the broader category of social dilemmas. That's all fine. A kind of normatively desirable future and a social dilemma present. The fundamental question is how you get from here to there, right? And it's in that sense that we also have to continually enrich our conversation about the commons with a conversation about politics. Because to me, granted, disciplinary bias, I'm a political scientist, but to me, politics is how we get from here to there. It's not about what the there is so much as it is who gets to decide, how are we going to decide, and if change is needed, how do we make change? So in a way, all roads lead back to Lynn when we have these kind of conversations, but the fact that there was a political scientist trying to think through how people manage sustainably common pool resources and how people escape the dilemma. For me anyway, that was part of my education, is like, how do we think about this, not just as a situation we can analyze, but as a situation we can change. So thanks.
No, thank you, Bill. Well said. Very much so. And Jamie, we had promised to return to you, so I'm sorry it took us a while, but we got back there eventually.
Well, I wasn't sure I needed to raise my hand, as a reminder or not, but if this is appropriate, then I'll be happy to go. And if not, I can wait. Oh, okay. Well, actually, I'm really intrigued about the question, right, about the classical economics and what we take and how we respond to that too, because I think, there's a couple of different ways to think about classical economics. There's classical economics as it's practiced in the 20th century, and then there's classical economics as it's practiced before that. And I think Lynn and Vincent very much were advocates for classical economics in the older historical sense, and which emphasized the political economy that Bill is talking about. And this conversation actually made me even wonder if Adam Smith's great question, why are some nations wealthy and why are some poor, makes me wonder if that's could be thought of as a commons question too, because of the idea of like having to cooperate and dialogue, and how do we solve each other's problems? But actually, I did have a follow-up question to, it was around the idea of commoning and commons, and it was something Bill said. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what prompted me in that direction, but you talked about contestation, and I wonder. That's something I have actually thought about a lot these days. I don't think we talk about the importance of contestation enough. And I think we see it in our society, like where like Twitter shuts down certain people, or even politicians will say, well, I couldn't pass this one side because my policy, because the other party just wouldn't agree to it. And I'm thinking, but what did you expect? That's what politics is. And I think the question, I wonder if the real tragedy of the commons isn't even the depletion of natural resources, but the depletion of our ability to converse with each other. And so I wonder, what is that a real danger? Like, is that a real danger? Like, the ability to communicate with each other and to learn how to contest well, is that a bigger threat to the commons than, say, some of the other challenges we're facing?
I would love to see a paper on that. I think that's such a fascinating question. Actually, sounds like you need to write that paper.
I'll just add it to my growing list.
That's right. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Foster.
Well, I teach at Georgetown Law, and we're having a lot of issues around speech, and just Google it.
No, I know what you're talking about. Yes, my friends are talking about that too.
Yeah. So, and I'm the associate dean for DEI this year, so I'm right in the middle of it. And
I don't envy you.
No, I don't envy me either. But these questions. But I think it's fascinating, right? This idea of kind of communicative space as a commons, right? Students talk about safe space. Some of us talk about brave spaces. Other people, want to cancel. Other people want to talk more. And I wonder what the commons would bring to that, what an analytical framework of the commons frame. That's so fascinating.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, that communication is just so vital to build coordination and eventually trust, right? Which, as Lynn famously said, it's the most important resource. I love it. This has been so weird. We just have a few minutes left, so maybe if there's a final. Oh yeah, Sally, I saw your hand go up as well. Let's turn to that, and we can maybe do a final round of perhaps wrap-up thoughts from Sheila and the other participants, please.
In response to Jamie's comment, maybe at a more macro level, I think Vincent Ostrom, an avid reader of Tocqueville, was particularly worried about, concepts such as tyranny of majority and soft despotism as well. And I think some of these problems also stem from the lack of communication or, inability to communicate properly. So this discussion perhaps can be held at more micro level, but also related to macro affairs as well. Thanks.
No, thank you, Sally. Really, really, really good point. Well, just maybe in the few minutes that we have left here, perhaps we could turn to a final round, and maybe Sheila, if it's okay, we'll give you the last word. and we can turn maybe just in the order that we presented for any final reflections, or frankly, for that matter, any thoughts about where we take the field from here, based on the goal of this project to kind of push the frontiers and also consolidate and ask some hard and hopefully provocative questions. So maybe Bill, we'll start with you, then go to Brian and Eric.
Yeah, just real brief, because I was cocooned in the workshop, and contestation was always in the context of collaboration, of people who are working towards the same goal, sitting down and saying to one another, okay, colleague, I think this, you think that, let's talk. And that's a long way, unfortunately, from encampments lobbing grenades at each other. And so I worry a little bit about that. And I don't envy anybody in a position like yours, Sheila, having to try to get people to collaboratively engage in contestation in such a charged environment. And I'm glad we at least got a chance to bring that up and make sure that we think about it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. No, I couldn't agree more. And Brian?
Yeah, I think I'll follow up on this contestation, and I think it's important for us individually. It's a real challenge how we can get better at doing that kind of discussion and ability to appreciate what somebody else is saying, what are things to consider in their argument, and then how we can learn from them. And I think that can be part of what is broader, and also the workshop community. I'll go ahead and be quite personal. As an example, there are a bunch of things where Prakash and I do not see eye to eye, but that's actually the benefit of somebody who's different enough that he has different views, while at the same time sharing a whole bunch of concepts and concerns and common reference points. So I think it's, and I certainly feel I have lots more to grow. It's easy to just be tempted, forget it, don't listen to them, as opposed to how to figure out to engage, especially when the other person may not want to approach that engagement in the same way. So, but how can I still appreciate, learn, and model something that can work together? Thanks.
Well said as well, Brian. Fantastic. Yeah, Eric, please.
I kind of have, if I had 3 feet, I would have 1 foot in the environment and 1 foot in social sciences and policy and 1 foot in economics. And, when I see that, it looks like economics has a tendency to kind of take over and, expand its sphere of influence. But I think this commons framework, these commons ideas really, and especially things like the IAD framework, can put economics, where it's useful, but economics is part of social science more broadly. And I think that looking at it that way lets us see the bigger picture. And I think that's been really helpful for me as a researcher, and I think in these discussions.
Thanks so much again, Eric. Yeah, and Sheila, the last word to you.
Sure, I would just say that our hope for the book, and shout out to my co-editor who was a PhD fellow here, who's no longer here, but our hope with the book is exactly this kind of conversation, actually, to open up this kind of conversation. And I think that this workshop has really been heartwarming in terms of how open people are to just exploring more. And I will say, on the idea of the communicative commons and some of the stuff I'm dealing with, I mean, I still am learning from Lynn, which is to say small scale matters. So huge school, let's create small communities but that are not homogenous, but that are heterogeneous, because that's what happens in the urban environment. People comment across difference in saturated, heterogeneous environments. And that's where we've kind of turned to look at that as a particular context. But it turns out you can do that, right? You can with some of the cheap talk. And so I'm actually applying some of those insights here in my role. And I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful. This cannot be done on Twitter. It cannot be done on an email exchange either. And it's been challenging in a pandemic where you have to get people together, create small settings, and so that people can talk across differences and find community without, I think Bill's suggestion is, consensus can often be a way to kind of reduce things down to the things we only agree on, and it blocks out a lot of contestation. So that's the trick, not to do that, right? And so I thought that Brian's point about, Prakash and I can disagree, but we can still talk to each other. Like, that's where we want to get. So anyway, thank you so much, everyone. It's been a real honor to be part of this project and to be in conversation with you.
Thank you, Sheila. This has been such a fantastic session. So thank you for all your help in pulling this together. Thanks to all the authors. Go out, read the book. We're going to be using it for sure. And the first ever Ostrom Workshop Summer Academy that we're beginning this summer. So couldn't be more excited about it. So thanks again so much, everybody, for joining. Happy Black History Month. Remember, next week, David Scarbeck will be featured in another Ostrom Book Club session about the puzzle of prison order. He's from Brown University, which is going to be a great discussion as well. So have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Scott, for your brilliant moderating. Thank you. Thank you.
Not at all. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.